everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending the Indonesia Study Group seminar. Today, we have a special topic by Professor Sofan Tajuddin from Western Sydney University. But first, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past and present. This is a hybrid event, so we will be taking questions from those in the room and online. And those who are online can write their questions in the question and answer box, and we will read them out. So Sofan Tajuddin is Associate Professor in Development Studies at Western Sydney University. He was visiting scholar at University of Oxford in UK, Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. His co-authored book, Structural Transformation and Development, Path Dependence and Geopolitics by Palgrave is coming out soon. And today he will be talking about democracy and or development, reflecting on the Lee thesis in Indonesia. So without further ado, Sofan.
Okay, thank you, Acho, for the introductions. Good to be back again in Canberra. Probably the last time I presented at this seminar series was about 10 years ago. So from the title that I'm going to talk for about half an hour, the title is a bit shaky, not something, how do you call it? Well, definitive things that economists used to present. So I'm very aware of that kind of thing. So you can think of pulling it to any directions. So, but that will be well reflected in the title. This is about reflecting on something, and then you know that when you reflect, you can put any kind of wild imagination. Okay, let me start. And the mouse is not working too. What happened? Yeah. Okay. Let me start with what is my argument. The argument is very simple. When we are linking, okay, I'll go into the Lee thesis. Right? This is about whether we want to choose between democracy and development, or we want to combine. So this is the argument. If we have two kinds of growth, one is growth under authoritarian regime or growth under democracy. What we can tell about Indonesian data, having experienced the authoritarian period and also the democratic period, the first thing to say is authoritarian growth is higher than democratic growth. You compare Suharto's Indonesia's growth and post-2000 Indonesia economic growth. That's real data. And then the second point next to that one is, although authoritarian growth is higher than democratic growth, authoritarian growth is unstable. That's proven with the breakdown of New Order economy and polity in 1998. And this proposition is supported by cross-country data, or if you look at around. But the problem is, if we look at what has happened about the public discussions, especially in Asia, the temptations to authoritarian growth is there and quite widespread. And probably the last blow of the authoritarian growth is the fall of the Bangladeshi government just two months ago in August. the 15 years of Sheikh Hasina rule in Bangladesh, experienced 6.4%, 1.5 decade growth, but turning into very authoritarian style. And then the regime collapsed. And it was in Bangladesh in May, I presented this argument for the first time. This is the second time. So if it is the case, if you think of Indonesia, the temptation is there too. The temptations to authoritarian growth is there in Indonesia. So if we are thinking of remembering Suharto, masih penak zamanku, something like that, this is a kind of longing into the what is called good old days of authoritarian growth in Indonesia between late 60s to late 90s. So then the last point here is into the argument is Indonesia now is the crossroads, whether to continue the authoritarian growth or to shift into, to continue the democratic growth or to shift into authoritarian growth. So the next point of the argument is Indonesia should not follow the authoritarian growth. The argument is democratic growth is a better option. So that's roughly the argument. Now let me elaborate. Let's start with the Lee thesis. This is referring to the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, Kuan Yew. And then this is about the choice between what the polity of the best polity for a country when a country started the development process from a very low base. So this is about argument is democracy may hinder economic growth and wider development. And this is very famous from Mr. Lee, the choice between two Ds, whether to follow discipline or democracy. So discipline is more important than democracy. And that has been proven in the case of Singapore.
Are those his words, discipline or democracy?
If I'm not mistaken, I'll show the quote before after this. Yeah. So and then the context of the thesis is the first one is the temptations to authoritarian growth, especially in Asia, and then the global trend of democratic backsliding. Now let's get into Kuan Yew. So this is basically not an academic thesis, but the way Kuan Yew is read, especially by Amartya Sen. So when someone put credence to a politician's, politician's sentences or statement, then you will see the weight of that kind of hypothesis. So this is the best that I can find. It was during Kuan Yew visit to Manila, and then he gave a speech, and then this is a quote from a newspaper, and you can easily read it. Contrary to what American political commentators say, I do not believe that democracy necessarily leads to development. I believe that what a country needs to develop is discipline more than democracy. The exuberance of democracy leads to undisciplined and disorderly conditions. So to this, discipline and democracy are very authentic from Kuan Yew. Now, this is politicians in 1992 or early 90s. And probably we can imagine what was the mood in the early 90s about authoritarian growth. Now, let's move backward a couple of decades. He was not alone. Let me just give you two quotes here. One is from a paper from Economic Development and Cultural Change from Carl de Schwenitz Jr., if I'm not mistaken. He was an economic professor at Northwestern University. And then I remember what was the title of the article about, I forgot the title, but it is there in my literature review in the draft paper. So Schwenitz argued for limiting democratic participations in political affairs if less developed countries wanted to. 1959. Yeah, it was just at the beginning of the decolonization process around the world. And then 10 years later, Asian drama from Gunnar Myrdal. Yes, Governor Mirdal was talking about India in particular, but you will find reference to Indonesia and the Philippines in the book. And what, based on my reading, we can say that he was pessimistic about Indonesia. And if I'm not mistaken, Indonesia was the basket case. It was from Mirdal. Indonesia was one of the poorest countries on earth. And then he was pessimistic about the prospect of Indonesia's development. And then what Mirdal said at that time, democracy might not be the best options to achieve desired development progress. Authoritarian regime might do better. And the two of them are economists. Gunnar Myrdal is an economist, and also Shen is an economist. Now, the question is, I reflect on myself. With a kind of economic training, if I had to live in the late 70s or early 60s, late 50s or early 60s, probably I will fully agree with this kind of thing, this kind of argument. This is just to reflect, right? But the question is, we are not living in the late 50s or early 60s. We are living in the 21st century, in the third decade of the 21st century. So what are the source of legitimacy for the thesis? Of course, the first legitimacy coming from Lee Kuan Yew himself, Singapore. And then the next to Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew is Taiwan's Chiang, Kai-shek, and Park Chung-hee, South Korea, and Mahathir Malaysia. So the four are the best examples of the authoritarian growth. So, but the problem is, this is very selective example of few success story. And we can't rely on something that is very selective. And then, based on the selective successful case will be very risky if that will have to be the model to be followed. And there are two studies here, systematic study, testing the link between regime type and economic performance, especially in Asia. So I quote here two papers. One is from Michael Rock, and the other one is from Karl Natsen, if I'm not mistaken, the full name. And then the conclusion was Lee thesis does not pass systematic tests. So this is anecdotal, especially represented by the four examples here: South Korea, Park Chung-hee, Taiwan's Chiang Kai-shek, Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad's Malaysia, and Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore. So that is the thesis. Now, this is very, very much oftenly quote example of the tale of two countries, if you like. But I read an article saying that stop comparing Singapore and Jamaica. But anyway, it is interesting to see this a kind of supporting anecdotal evidence for the Lee thesis. I look at the data. We compare data from 1960s and 2022, and look at the level of income and democracy. So the starting point was roughly similar, but the outcome is completely different. Singapore is with per capita GDP of $82,000, while Jamaica is only $6,000. And then you look at about democracy, if you check the liberal democracy index from the VDEM data set, the score of Singapore will stay around 0.3, but Jamaica is different. Jamaica is considered a free country, 0.7, much higher than Indonesia, I believe. So that's also another anecdotal comparison. Now, what is the concern? The concern is, in addition to the successful case of authoritarian growth, if you look at other examples of authoritarian growth, we will find also the tragic cases of authoritarian high growth. And the first example is Soviet Union, Pakistan's development decade in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, Pakistan was, if I'm not mistaken, was the role model for the newly independent countries, post-colonial countries to refer to. And in 1960s, the prospect for Pakistan to be much more advanced countries it was much better than South Korea, for example. So that's about the Soviet Union. But Indonesia can also be put into this kind of list here. The tragic end of the 3 decades of Suharto's authoritarian growth. So in those 4 tragic cases, Soviet Union, Pakistan, and Indonesia, we know that it was the collapse of Soviet Union, and then also Pakistan, the country cut into 2, Pakistan and Bangladesh. And then in Indonesia, the worst scenario was not there, but some kind of disintegrations was there with the departure of East Timor in 1999 referendum. So all 3 high growth authoritarian regimes share the same fate. High growth followed by economic collapse, political crisis, and some kind of implosions of the country. So the next one, we can put also Bangladesh here. So, but we need to see whether the effect of the current crisis in Bangladesh will resonate with the collapse of the economy. That yet to be seen, that kind of outcome. So that's why I put Bangladesh separately from Soviet Union, Pakistan, and Indonesia. Then, what is the fault lines here? So probably we can put a kind of prepositions that authoritarian growth doesn't seem to be sustainable. And then I found that one article from Danny Rodriguez exactly said that the title was "The Myth of Authoritarian Growth." So from that one, we can assume that authoritarian growth is a myth too, not something not to follow, not something not to be used as a reference. So now I want to bring in Amartya Sen here about this. The article is in 1999. And this is about how to see the link between democracy and development. So the idea here is not to contradict, whether to choose, you follow development path and then you have to make peace with democracy somehow, and then you wait till you are ready for democracy. So this is very much in the flavor of modern assessment hypothesis, something that can describe clearly the path of to democracy of the Western developed countries, and also the 4 success story in East Asia: South Korea, Taiwan in particular. So now, what we can argue here, I'm now here following Amartya Sen. It is wrong to ask whether a country is fit for democracy. You are ready to adopt democracy, not to adopt that one when you are not ready. But the argument should be, it is wrong to ask whether a country is fit for democracy, but a country will fit through democracy. So probably this is probably the new wisdom that more resonant with the 21st century, rather than the situations in late 50s or in the late 50s and in the 60s. So for the argument for democracy, probably it is good to bring the differentiations between factor-driven economy and innovation-driven. So authoritarian growth could be good in running the economy using the factor-driven, but if you want to grow further, factor-driven is not, factor alone is not enough. The country will need to move into what is called the innovations-driven. So what can facilitate innovations? Democracy will facilitate innovations, not silencing the society in the autocratic setting. So that's to differentiate between innovations and factor-driven economy. And the second argument that can be also put here to put some backup or argument for democracy as a better choice rather than the authoritarian growth, this is the differentiations by Krugman about inspirations-driven and perspirations-driven. So inspirations will be facilitated by democracy. Perspirations is probably equivalent with the opposite of innovations, factor-driven growth or factor-driven economy. So using the argument of innovation-driven and inspiration-driven, that probably can be used to substantiate, to argue for democratic growth is better than authoritarian growth in the context of the 21st century, not in the 1950s or 1960s. Now let's look at Indonesia. Yes, the Indonesian transitions to democracy actually saved Indonesia from the Balkanizations. Only a very small part of Indonesia out from the federations. But if we compare the three major crises that Indonesia has gone so far in the modern history, one is the 1998 Asian crisis, second one is the GFC, and the last one is the COVID crisis. Democratic Indonesia survived the last two crises, but autocratic Indonesia collapsed in the case of the first crisis. In the last two crises, Indonesia was least affected and also performed much better than the other major countries in Southeast Asia. So probably if we look at okay, this is just to show you the data, the growth of the biggest four countries in Southeast Asia, and then you look at the economic growth or contractions in the three crises, and you see how good Indonesia compared to the other three. So that's to back up that argument. So the point here is, what happened to the Asian crisis? Indonesia was the hardest hit in the Asian crisis, but what happened to the success story of two authoritarian growth, but successfully transitions to democracy in the 80s? I'm referring to South Korea and Taiwan. And democratic South Korea and Taiwan were much more resilient dealing with the 1998 Asian crisis. But the less democratic Malaysia suffered a lot. The more authoritarian Indonesia suffered the worst. So again, this is anecdotal, right? So that's to look at the comparison. Now let's what about the democratic data, the democratic quality or democracy index of the four countries here? You look at the data since 2000 for the past 2 decades. Consistently, Indonesia has a higher democracy index compared to Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. So more democratic Indonesia is more resilience to economic crisis. Now, if you look at the long-term trajectory of Indonesia's real GDP. So the red one is the real GDP, and the blue lines is assuming that the long-term growth of the authoritarian growth continue. That will be the case. So that will be what is called the permanent loss. So what would be the ideal scenario? If we can reflect, again, this is reflections. If can be anything, right? If Suharto was good enough, if Suharto was benevolent enough to lead Indonesia to transitions to democracy nicely, peacefully, constructively, probably that crisis should not be there. And then Indonesia will continue with a bit slower. But democratic Indonesia is not resilient as the way democratic South Korea or democratic Taiwan during the Asian crisis. Now, the next backup for the temptations to authoritarian growth is, okay, people say that Singapore is a small country, 5 million people, small island country, probably not too good to be used as a reference, but now you have China. And China was not included in the East Asian Miracle book. But after East Asian Miracle, what we have is what the world have seen is China Miracle. So, and there are a lot of attractions to the Chinese success, the choice between democracy and development. So this is very much a very shaky area to get in, but I just want to refer briefly here as part of reflections. Probably this is too early to refer to. It took 50 years to show the stress in the Soviet Union economy and 70 years to implode, and we have to see and wait what happened with China. But after all, you know, each and every country's trajectory is unique. No two countries are alike. So no one really knows, right? And each and every country will have to struggle with their own path. So, but the point here is what we can look at, especially from to Singapore. I remember a very powerful speech and presentation frequently repeated by Kishore Mahbubani, that three things that could be learned from the success of Singapore, the terminology of MPH, meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. And he refers that one where Kuan Yew lead the country to show the three things: meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. And the political meritocracy now has been also widely quoted to explain Singapore and also to explain China. More and more academics, scholars now writing about China, and one of them, probably one of the comprehensive one, more is there in the literature. If I'm not mistaken, his name is Daniel Bell, if I'm not mistaken. I forgot the title of the book. But here, he is very sympathetic with China's model of development. So in the book, it says that China may have internal check and balances within the party, adopting meritocratic party structure and competitions for leadership based on merit. So a kind of political meritocracy is there that somehow accompany the success of Singapore and also the current miracle in China. So probably the next reflections that we can put on the table. For those other countries like Indonesia, like Bangladesh, like Philippines, for example, if they are tempted to follow authoritarian growth, quote unquote, probably the first questions to ask is, do they have political meritocracy embedded into the history of governance and policymaking? Probably that's the big questions. Something that can be proven somehow in the case of China, in the case of Singapore. Singapore may also has a meritocratic system, even though a semi-democracy. So from here, I learned a lot listening to Kishore Mahbubani's eloquent presentations. The last one, to conclude. So this is not to dichotomize democracy and development. Democracy and development probably has been contradicted in the 1950s, 1960s. So I said again, if I had a PhD, I am a young academic in late 50s or early 60s, probably I would say the same thing, what has been said by Myrdal and Karl de Schwenitz, probably. If you think of the contemplating of the situations in Asia in 1950s, 1960s. And then that exactly was the conviction, the call made by Lee Kuan Yew. And if we reflect on, to read again Myrdal will say that for the Asian drama is basically the unfortunate reading of Asia to progress in the 1950s, right? And then he wrote the three big books about the 3 volumes of Asian drama. So he said that authoritarian probably do better rather than the democratic one. So probably that was the call at the time. And then that resonated with the way Lee Kuan Yew make call also for how he will move with Singapore. So now, since we are now living 50 years after the 70 years after 1950s, 1960s, so probably sense argument will be much more suitable, not to contradict democracy and development, but to combine. So basically, a country will fit through democracy, not to wait for a country ready to implement democracy. But eventually, this is not about the choice, but who can choose? No one can choose. And if you look at the each and every country's trajectory in certain time, this is just to follow the destiny, not really about the choice. So, and the last one that I want to say to back up that argument, probably this is related to the intrinsic value of democracy. Democracy that allow dissent, allow differences, and democracy also facilitate peaceful conflict resolutions, something that cannot be done by the authoritarian polity. So now, if we reflect on Indonesia, if we are moving into autocracy, this is not about black and white, but the tendency is very clear. With the personality, with the trend for the past few years, we are moving into that directions. What I can say now is, again, a reflections. Moving into authoritarian growth is not a good option. Better for Indonesia to stay at democratic growth. Probably democratic growth will be somehow messy, that what said by Lee Kuan Yew, but overall, my convictions that will deliver more stable and more opportunity for innovation-driven and inspirations-driven economy, rather than factor-driven or aspirations. I think I will end there. I'm aware that this is very much open for any questions, but thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Pak. Very interesting. I'm presuming this is the basis of an article or something that you're beginning to work on. And if that's the case, this is more of a comment than a question. I would really urge you to sort of rethink the opening and framing of a piece of research like this. I mean, because you kind of give the audience the impression that you're setting out to sort of test Lee's thesis as though it were an academic thesis that is testable, when in fact we know that his comments and the way he set all that up was, very self-serving, right, politically. And then the other reason for rethinking the framing is that it sounds very dated. And, there's so much literature that has evolved when it comes to this question of the relationship between political institutions, regime types, and economic development. Does democracy affect development? Does development affect democracy? What's the relationship between growth and regime transitions? And I didn't see much of that literature in this presentation. I mean, I think the cases that you looked at sort of picked out and compared, that's all very well, but, I really feel like with a project like this, you need to speak to, or at least have in your literature review, all this scholarship that does, really broad cross-country stuff and uses quantitative data or looks at, large, and that's not what you have to do, but at least to set up the study, give us a real sense of where is the literature at right now on this question of the relationship between political institutions, regime type and development. And I think once you do that, you'll find there's all this really interesting nuanced debate that you can speak to much more productively about things like corruption, what kinds of institutions, not just regime type, but specifically what kinds of institutions matter when it comes to economic development, right? I mean, you hinted at meritocracy, but the other really big one is corruption and types of corruption. So Steph Haggard's work, Vivian Ang's recent work, that's where we're at now. And I feel like the Indonesian case can speak really productively to that literature. So I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
That's very true, Eve. I'm not doing any kind of hard data crunching here. As you look at from the title, this is reflecting on the Lee hypothesis on Indonesia. So if you want to use Prabowo's very, very famous phrase, this is just omon-omon. But I'm doing the omon-omon seriously. So that's why I try to develop the argument, and the argument is like that. And probably something that I can refer here. Of course, remember that about the current Nobel Prize in economics.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. And I'm aware of one of the Acemoglu et al. Paper 2019. The title was Democracy Does Cause Growth. So probably that another empirical literature to say that. So if we follow that kind of new empirical, more powerful empirical paper compared to the two studies that I refer to one is 2009 and 2010, only limiting sample to about 21 Asian countries. A Acemoglu article in 2009 about 2019, Democracy Does Cause Growth, will be much more powerful, much more systematic. So from that perspective, that will give the argument of shifting the state of understanding of the two sources that I quote in the 1959 and 1968 to choose authoritarian regime for economic development. Now, basically, the new empirical study by Acemoglu and friends will be much more in line with the idea of Amartya Sen. A country will fit through democracy rather than to wait. So, yes, I have a lot to do about reading the literature, but at least the flavor of the argument is there. Thank you, Eve.
You raise your hand, and you go first, and then Tony, and then Masbudi. Okay, you first.
So my question is,
Sorry, what's your name again?
Jefferson. My name is Jefferson. I'm a PhD student at ESE.
Right.
And I have a question regarding for Pak on have you considered like alternative explanations for either the weakness of democratic growth in Malaysia or the supposed strength of authoritarian growth? Because I think something important to consider is also that if you look at what Samuel Huntington said, the most important political distinction between countries is not the form of government, but the degree of government. So my sense is, if you look at cases like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, state organization played a very significant role also in pushing growth, although it was authoritarian, but if you have authoritarian regime without like a well-established state infrastructure, then it is unlikely that development will be robust as well. And then my second point is also that I read this recent book called The Narrow Corridor. So it's actually a book by two economists that talk about how economic growth is generated when economic growth is sustainable and generated from state development coupled with robust societal mobilization. So could societal mobilization be the factor here that is producing good quality democratic growth rather than democracy itself? So is the thing that you are looking at not democracy, but the effects that are produced by democracy? So that's just something that.
Yeah, quick response. When you say about not the type of government, is it autocratic or democratic, not the type of regime, or polity, is it autocratic or democratic, but the type of government, right?
More like the degree of government.
Yeah, the degree. Okay. So that's where the temptation is. That's where the temptation is. If, say, for example, Suharto to be Lee Kuan Yew, Indonesia will be very happy. If Prabowo to be a kind of Lee Kuan Yew kind of leader, everyone will be happy, just like how happy is Singaporeans. But the problem is, what is the chance of getting Lee Kuan Yew? What is the probability? What is the probability? Should Indonesian will count on that very tiny probability, but risking You hope for Lee Kuan Yew, you get Mobutu. You hope for Chiang Kai-shek, you get Idi Amin. You hope for Mahathir, you get Marcos. So that's why I said before, that was a risky choice. The evidence was there. I mean, the example, but that very limited example. So that's why I said that this risky choice, the most safer choice in the 21st century is to go with democracy, not to somehow put hope in a new kinds of authoritarian policy. So I think that would be my quick response.
Tony.
Thank you very much. A whole bunch of interesting things, but just on this debate that Eva raised, I think you're choosing perhaps rather to be a public intellectual than to be a professional political scientist. And that makes a big difference, because actually few of us read professional political science. And
I'm not a political scientist either.
We won't be that. I mean, the public intellectuals should quote it, they should be aware of it, but it is a different world, and it's not to be dismissed, especially if you want to have some influence in Indonesia, which you may do, on Prabowo, who could choose enough. I mean, he's smart enough and ruthless enough to be a Lee Kuan Yew if he chooses the light rather than the dark. Just two other specifics. I lived in Singapore for 7 years and was constantly, of course, obsessed with this issue. But the most striking reason why Singapore gets a very low rating in democracy is freedom of the press. It's totally zero, you know, and that's certainly self-serving. In particular, you're not allowed to say anything rude about the BAP or about the Lee family. But when you think about the role of the Murdoch press empire in democracies recently, you can't help thinking something has to be done. I mean, when the freedom of the press means the power of particular, somewhat weird and extreme ideology, then something has to be done to control. The other thing I thought of saying, you didn't mention Vietnam, which is because I suppose the old literature didn't. But of course, we of the 50s and 60s, you know, we were obsessed by communism versus the free world, and it turned out that the communism, and not just of China and Vietnam and Cambodia, but Indonesia too. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, everybody was a Marxist, and all the nationalists thought, well, at least we got to get rid of foreign investment. Number one, get rid of that. That will be free. And that was a terribly bad idea, it turned out. And I don't know when it happened, in the middle of the 70s. I sometimes think it's 65, because it was a key moment for Singapore as for Indonesia. When foreign investment became a good thing, and instead of an evil thing. The communists, they didn't do well in the measurements of economists. They did well with education, getting mass education. They did well, relatively well with relative equality for women and so forth, getting rid of all the, the constraints of past society. But they didn't do well with the normal economic indices because they opposed foreign investment. Once they embraced foreign investment, maybe that's the new kind of 21st century. I was very struck also that, besides China and Vietnam, Singapore is halfway to being influenced by the Leninist model of party organization. The PAP is very disciplined. It has a cell structure. It's extremely ruthless about anybody who steps out of the party and tries to then criticize it. I mean, that's who they really go for. So, I mean, in many ways, it's the very strong party, strong and ruthless party, combined with plenty of foreign investment and the those criteria, which are more or less established. But I wondered if one should bring, at least as a historian, thinking of what changed between the 50s, 60s, and now. I mean, it's the the mistake of opposing foreign investment and globalization. That is the one thing that clearly the lefties, who we all thought might prevail, missed out on.
Well said, Pak Tony, about the reference on the 50s and 60s. So, but I'm not a political scientist. I haven't done any degree in political science. So I'm sorry for giving the impressions that I'm a political scientist, but my field is quite unclear. We call it development studies. If I can ridicule where I am now, but I'm happy to be there. So what I'm doing is basically to be sympathetic with to read the society, to do the reflections, and to be sympathetic with all disciplines. So that's where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Suharto, for the presentation. So my
Speak louder, Mas.
yeah. So my question is probably almost similar with him. He said that it's not about the democratic system or authoritarian, but the quality of government. But I will be more specific. It is about some economic policies like fiscal, better fiscal budget, fiscal capacity, investment on school education. So that is that link directly to development. So the question is, that you probably would like to observe is whether democracy or authoritarian that could lead or have bigger probability to produce those kind of policy. And the discussion on that is not is missing. So you just jump directly democratic authoritarianism. And if you look at through several cases, it is probably not that clear which one that actually produce a better policy. And people like Asumoglu argue that democratization will have a bigger probability to produce those kind of policy. Yeah, so that I thought that if you could also discuss those issues.
Yeah, a lot to be included in the paper. I have a very crude draft paper at this stage, not really to be shown to the public, but just two quick comments about the policy. What type of regime that will have less risk to produce bad policy? Democratic regime is the one that will have less risky to produce bad policy. Think of Indonesia. If Indonesia for the past few years, under the autocratic, quote unquote, polity or tendency, there will be less check and balances, less dissenting opinions. So good policy will be coming out from battle, right? So if everyone agrees in the parliament, everywhere, everyone agree, yes, that's great, where will be check and balances? But under, say, meaningful oppositions, a substantive voice to dissent, that will scrutinize any kinds of policy that will be invented. But with the current reading of Indonesia, probably that will be, everyone will say, yes, great. We are moving into Indonesia Emas. And then we don't know what will happen. So my quick response is, the risk for bad policy will be higher under authoritarian polity. So the risk will be less under democracy. So that's why the argument is Indonesia will have to choose. This is not about black and white, but tendency. The choice is to maintain the democratic polity and under democratic growth.
Before let's ask if there is a question online.
We have
Go back to you, Randy.
we have 33 participants online, and we have two questions here. The first one is from Terry Hull. He asked about, are you arguing that authoritarianism is a choice? It would seem to be a failure of the majority to overcome the pressures of the minority. Do you argue that the new president is turning toward authoritarianism? Any evidence? And then the second one is from Dr. Bedri Sahim from Germany.
Can we stop there?
Oh, yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay, my quick response. I'm not arguing for or advocating for authoritarian future for Indonesia. No. My argument is very clear. I'm arguing for democratic path, not to even consider authoritarian polity. So that would be my clear answer to that one. And then, is Indonesia a kind of turning into authoritarianism? Is there any evidence? I think that has been well argued. If I remember what I listened to Indonesia Update just a month ago, that was the conclusions. So I just need to quote many papers from the last Indonesia Update.
Right.
And the second
The
one?
second one is from Dr. Bejuri Sahin from Germany. He said, BRICS, BRICS is still a political organization. Could it become a military organization in the future? What do you think about the future of BRICS? Yeah.
I can't answer that one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for that one. I'm not going to venture into that.
Sarah, did you first? Sarah first, and then you go to yes, Sarah.
I guess a question about the part of your presentation where you argue that democracy brings more innovation. I wonder, I don't think it depends on what kind of innovation, especially in terms of technological innovation. You can think about, the space program in Soviet Union, US, think about EVs in China. Like, is there any empirical evidence that democracy actually causes more innovation in the technology?
On top of my head now, I cannot provide any empirical evidence. Probably this is something for me to look for, to back up my argument saying that democracy will be much more favorable for innovations rather than factor. Remember that? I differentiate between innovation and factor. So I cannot refer to any empirical evidence at this stage. But just quickly, if you think of innovations is represented by the award for Nobel Prize in science, where the majority of Nobel Prizes is allocated to democratic country. So the more innovations in the democratic polity rather than, say, quote unquote, authoritarian polity. So probably that quick evidence, probably. I haven't done sufficient reading on that one. Yeah.
Per capita between democratic and authoritarian regime, number of Nobel Prize
Per capita.
per capita.
Oh, that's even more powerful to say that per capita will be higher in the democratic polity.
Because the authoritarian are not as many as the democratic probably.
You can continue on that.
Yeah.
Let's take another. Yes.
I'm Tanya Beckbo. I'm in culture, history, and language here at ANU. As a fellow PhD in that ill-defined field of development studies. So we talked about how the different types of democratic regimes would affect development, but I wondered if you could kind of pack up, what am I trying to say? Unpack, sorry, development. So you're talking here mostly about development as economic growth. You do have development as freedom up here on the board, but of course, what development is very, large and ill-defined. What is it about particular democratic regimes or democracy, even in an ideal sense, which caters to or which can create development in these different kinds of indicators beyond economic growth? You want to sorry, I was a bit.
Yeah, I'm trying to make up my mind. Of course, as fellow development studies, we would like to define development in much more broader, inclusive, substantive sense of economics is one of them. You have social development, and also you have freedom is probably the latest, most advanced definitions as development as freedom. When you ask about what type of democracy, there are not two democracies alike. And democracy is basically everyone's struggle. And even those who reach the most advanced level of democracy, they are struggling to maintain. So I can't really go into very well-defined categories or type of democracy, but I think I will stay with a broader sense of democracy. Now, on the broader sense of democracy, let me just say 2 points here. I read somewhere, I forgot where I read this. There are 2 elements of democracy. One is electoral competitions. No democracy without electoral competitions. Second one is check and balances. So the move toward authoritarianism from democracy or setback, you can imagine that the situation would be you maintain competitions because you can't get rid of that one, otherwise you'll be categorized as non-democracy, but you continually curtail check and balances. And then what has been happening in Indonesia is exactly this. Indonesia after 1999, not really successful in developing a good quality check and balances. But what we have seen for the past 5 years or so, a systematic derail of check and balances. And I can mention what I'm referring to. So probably here is, I'm not going into the what types of democracy, very categorical. I think my direction would be, I will stay at the reflective level of the paper.
What do you think of India?
Democratic score in India is lower than Indonesia. And I can tell you, the World Opinion Survey, Pew Research Center, the survey in 2023, they survey public opinion about acceptance to democracy. Acceptance to authoritarianism in 24 countries, including Indonesia, India, few countries in Africa and Latin America, all dominant, important countries. And you know that the highest acceptance of authoritarianism is in India, 87%. You know the second one? Indonesia, 85%. So this is the starting point of this kind of discussions. So the worry is there.
So what's your best democracy now?
Democracy is a struggle of each and every one. And each and every country will have to struggle their own way. There's no point of copying, but lesson learned is there. But Indonesia have their own struggle. We don't know where we are heading.
And is there more?
Yes, so we have 2 more questions from online people. If we think from Chiang, if we think about the question from the perspective of equitable growth rather than growth, how would that affect the overall thesis? Growth does not matter as much as distribution of economic activity. How would the reflection incorporate this lens?
I think my response would be, if equitable growth is better than concentrated growth, you will have what is called growth without development. Equitable growth, where you will have growth with development. If we look at now you can get that one from authoritarian polity, you can get that one from democracy, right? But the risk, look at the way Indonesia is running now. So the tendency you will see it. If you are talking about extractive or inclusive institutions, what kind of institutions that govern Indonesia now, or for the past 5 years, for example? This is more extractive than inclusive, right? I think Benny will agree with me, saying that the type of institutions in Indonesia now is more extractive rather than inclusive, as postulated by Acemoglu. So if you want equitable growth, I think the best bet is through democratic growth rather than authoritarian growth. That would be my argument.
Second one from Johan. He said, it is good to talk about democracy for Indonesia. On the other hand, should we also recognize the Indonesian political landscape, governance, corruption, and culture. So in this case, a hybrid option mixed between democracy and authoritarian to grow and lead Indonesia is possible.
I think this is trial and error. Our current president could try. Who can prevent him to try?
Pak Chris, silakan Pak.
Very interesting book. The one thing that sticks in my mind is that I'm not convinced on the China case. I mean, it's such a big, diverse country, and you know, it must have a heavy weight in favour of some autocratic, significant autocratic controls, in particular of political institutions. How do you? I don't see it fitting into your argument there.
If you ask me, I'm not convinced too. If you ask me. But what I can say here, why I mentioned China here, the China a kind of giving the legitimacy, not the legitimacy, provide the more powerful basis for the temptations to authoritarian growth. Because China will resonate better with other large developing countries compared to Singapore, because Singapore is unique in terms of geography, small, a lot homogeneous in terms of typical of the Confucian part of the world. So, but China is still within the Confucian culture. But why China is put here? Because China is putting most time to that kind of temptations. And temptation is there. Probably in India too, temptation is there probably. If we follow the debate between whether they are pro-Modis or anti-Modis, for example, and citing all the economic indicators and all those things for the past 15 years in India, like for the past 15 years in Bangladesh. So I'm not convinced too. But so that's why here it's not about what model to follow, but again, each and every country, society journey is unique to its own. So coming back to Indonesia, Indonesia will have to in the religious term, they will have to do their own ijtihad. So if I can refer to, so probably that one part. See, we are on the reflecting kind of mode, Chris.
Any other questions, comments? No?
Any other question online, Pak Chung?
Okay.
So this is from Gita Putri Damayana. She asked about which part of democracy or freedom will be sacrificed under the guise of country unity or development, for the lack of better term under the new administration.
Can you repeat?
Which part of democracy or freedom will be sacrificed under the guise of country unity or development, for the lack of better term under the new administration?
Okay. I don't think electoral competitions will be sacrificed. Electoral competition is the last thing to keep, right? But if you look at the elements of check and balances, control of corruptions, right? Check and balances in terms of state institutions, between the legislative and executive, between, say, institutions like constitutional court, like ombudsman, like competition commissions. Those are institutions put in place to make sure that check and balances. Now you can see where we are moving in terms of the early investment of Indonesia's democracy. So if you look at each and every component of check and balances, that will be sacrificed. That's the directions that we can see. But Indonesia will still have a very competitive electoral competitions. But competitive electoral competitions without check and balances is a very not not good guide for the future.
Do you have any inside information about which intellectual model Prabowo is likely to adopt, or which guru he will hire?
I don't have any insider information, but my sense is, I'm sure that he likes Lee Kuan Yew. He likes Putin. He likes Xi, I guess.
He probably likes Trump.
I don't know. I would not say that. I think that's...
Yeah, one or two more questions. Go ahead.
Oh, we have more from Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay. That's amazing.
Now, he asked, what risk might Indonesia face in terms of employment and health inequality under a government that leans toward remilitarization? Could remilitarization disproportionately benefit certain sectors, such as defense, infrastructure, while sidelining others that contribute to inclusive employment, health system, and environment, such as social services or green industries?
If you ask about the possibility of having health equity, better employment outcome, if the option is can or cannot, militarizations can produce those kind of things on paper. Yeah, it can. Why not? But the question is, let's look at who we are, who run, what we can learn from the past to predict the future. My question is, will militarization in Indonesia deliver health equity, more employment outcome? Each and every one of us can answer that one, can put our own reading on that. Yeah. No one will be more legitimate to say something on that one compared to others.
Next one.
Okay. This is anonymous. Do you think Prabowo will adopt democracy and enforce accountability of his administration? How will he deal with such capitalists who support his campaign? Yeah.
I'm not convinced. No, when you say that this is about reflecting. Reflecting is looking at the past, trying to understand the future. You make mistake about this, but if you ask me, I'm not convinced.
Okay. Any last question or comment? No? If not, please join me in thanking Dr.
Thank you.